This is the fourth lecture of chapter 1 of sociology. In this lecture, I want to talk about some people. There are a lot of people on this list, and if we were together, I would ask you if you recognize any names. And for the sake of not having a 25-minute video lecture, I just want to focus on a few people. Very briefly, Auguste Comte is credited with the fellow that coins the term study of society. And, rumor has it that he wasn't studying society to make it better for all people, but he wanted to apply some of the principles of the animal kingdom where he would weed out the weak. Harriet Martineau is a significant name on the list. For one reason, she is only one of two females. Harriet right here, and you have a woman over here by the name of Jane Addams, who I'll talk about in a minute. Harriet Martineau is credited with the founding, if you will, of women's studies, or the area of literature and discipline that focuses on the experiences of women. And some historians tell stories. She was a woman of privilege, and we know that partly because she could read in a time where women were given the opportunity to read. And the stories go that, because it was inappropriate for women to read, this was seen as interfering with her reproduction. And of course, if women read, too much blood would go to their head and it wouldn't go to their ovaries and to their uterus, and it would make them, they would quit menstruating if they read too many books. And so historians tell us that Harriet, because she was a woman of privilege, she would write about women's experience, and she wrote a book called Women in Society. And when people were in the room, she would put her writing and her reading under her skirt, and when she was alone, and pull out her needlework, but when she was alone, that she would write. Now, of course, she didn't write about all women's experience because she was a woman of privilege. She wrote about the experiences of privileged women. Herbert Spencer, below her here, is a really important term. And he goes right along here with, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, yeah. So you may have heard the phrase social Darwinism. This is often credited with Charles Darwin, but Darwin didn't in fact use that term. That term was used by Spencer. And the story goes is that if you're familiar with Darwinism and evolution and the idea of survival of the fittest, and that is those that are most able to adapt. I recently heard a story where they were talking about COVID is a fit virus because it adapts and therefore it survives. When Darwin was talking about it, he was talking about it in terms of, animals, and that they would modify their biology so that they could eat the food that was available. Spencer takes Charles Darwin's idea of adaptation and fitness, and he applies it to people and argues that basically that people who are adaptable, who have, and you can fast forward this into the current time, and you can talk about people who have lots of different job skills, people who have good social skills, they are more successful, they are more fit, and therefore they live to pass their genes on into the next generation. So Darwinism, the idea of adaptation and fitness and survival, gets applied to people. And when you think about it from a sort of a capitalist perspective, the question is, effectively, people that have more resources are therefore more fit, and the people that don't have resources, because people that don't have resources, people that don't have money not to buy healthcare, they are less fit, and therefore they die off, right? Which is not, anyway, so takes that's social Darwinism. Durkheim here, we'll talk about his theory of functional theory here in a minute. Durkheim is famous for his work on what it was called suicide, and he observed, he was looking for patterns, and we've talked about patterns and social facts in a previous lecture. He observed that there were patterns relative to who committed suicide, and he noticed that it was men were more likely to commit suicide, unmarried and unemployed. And these were the social facts. And so he set out to explain these social facts. And he concluded, his theory that he imagined was one in which people were more likely to commit suicide if they were not integrated. And he called, or is also credited with this concept of anomie. And I think it's a German word. This word refers to normlessness, and it's basically people who don't follow the social norms, and so they are normalists, right? And people who are normalists are not integrated, and they are more likely to commit the most illogical act of death by suicide, or taking their own life. Karl Marx might be a name that you recognize. He's not, I like to say he's a great American hero, but that's a joke. Of course he's not. But I do think that Marx gets kind of a bad rap. We focus on, in our culture, we associate him with communism and with socialism, and we see that as entirely bad. But Marx is, at least over in this culture, he's kind of misunderstood. And we'll talk a lot about his theory. He is considered the father of conflict theory, but most basically what conflict theory basically says, and this is a very simplified explanation, but basically said that there are the people at the top who have a certain interest or certain social interests, and there are people at the bottom who have certain social interests, and these interests are mutually exclusive. In other words, these guys have a set of interests and these people have a set of interests, and they will forever be in conflict with each other. And he argued that every social group has at least two groups that are in competition, and they have different opposing interests. And at the end of the day, the symbolic day, so to speak, whoever has the most power will get their way. And that the way, and we'll talk, like I said, you'll hear a lot about conflict theory as the semester goes along, but I think you can apply his ideas pretty much to any environment. In a traditional classroom, the teacher has interests, the students have interests, and they are not the same, right? And so who has more power in those relationships? He argues that every social relationship is about power, and there is a difference in distribution of power, who gets to decide. Max Weber, sometimes students will call him Max Weber, I guess, right? He is also considered one of the founding sociological thinkers. His theory is symbolic interactionism, and it's a little bit where Durkheim was observing patterns and Marx was talking about, power. Weber says, it's a little bit more abstract than that. And for instance, when he talked about one's social location in terms of social class, he's credited with this phenomena or this concept of 3 Ps. And he said, so where Marx says social class is you are either an owner of the factory or a worker, he said there were 2. Weber argued that, no, it's more like he called power, property, and prestige. And that different people give different meaning to different things. And I'll talk more about the idea of a social construct, but that it's all about how we understand and the meaning that we give to things. George Simmel up here at the top. I actually don't know why he's still in my PowerPoint slides. I haven't talked about George Simmel for a long, long time, but he is considered a contemporary, which means he's part of the 20th century, and he's credited with, he observed that groups, when you get 2 people together, basically you have one relationship. When you get 3 people together, now you have the number of relationship grows exponentially. And he's credited, I believe he studies things like bureaucracies, and observes that the larger that the group gets, the more complicated the relationships between the groups, and we begin to break down the division of labor. So this is a very sociological observation, and that this, when organizations get big, they have to have more policies, that 2, 3 small groups can really be informal, the larger groups have to be more formalized. Jane Addams, I just adore talking about Jane Addams because so many social science disciplines like her. She's the social workers claim her as a social work. She shows up in the psychology textbook and she shows up in the sociology textbook. She is famous for establishing a place. You can still visit it in Chicago. It's called the Hull House, and this was what was referred to as a settlement house. And that was a place where new immigrants to the city of Chicago, they could come, they could stay there, they could learn things like English and expected standards of hygiene, and they could learn about politics. In other words, like, how does our legal system work? And this is what's called social capital. And this is really what became the birth of social work, right? Where you empower people with information and knowledge so that they can be more successful. The interesting stories about Jane is that for a period of time, she was on the government watch list because some would argue she was making it too easy for new immigrants to be successful, right? So during the McCarthy era, she was considered an enemy of the state. Eventually, she got the Nobel Peace Prize, and there is some rumor that she was, in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt's lesbian lover. I don't know if any of that is true or not, but she's just a fascinating individual, really a rabble-rouser during her time. W.E.B. Du Bois on here. He is the only person of color on the whole list. He's considered the founder of the NAACP, first Black man to ever get a PhD from Harvard. I believe that's correct. So he wrote a classic book called The Souls of Black Folk. But there are places, there's Du Bois Institute. He's quoted all over, statuary around the country. So he's really was an outspoken civil rights activist. I don't actually remember why Parsons is on here. He's a contemporary. Haven't talked about him in a long time either. Minton, he's a contemporary. Haven't talked about him in a long time. C.W. Mills or C. Wright Mills, he's often credited with, he's a contemporary as well. He's credited with something called it's right there at the tip of my tongue, the power elite. And the power elite, he argued, so if you've ever heard the phrase, the military-industrial complex, that's an example of the power elite. And the power elite is and you can apply that concept to different kinds of organizations, but it's the idea that within any organization, there's a small number of people who make decisions, right? So if you use the classic structure, basically this is the structure of like any organization, there's always a few people at the top and a whole bunch at the bottom, but there would be these few people who have shared interests, and they make a lot of decisions that are good for them with really minimal input or minimal regard for the people at the bottom. And this is an example of a power elite. And sometimes the power elite can be a function literally of space, that people all live next door to each other and they have social events. This is kind of some of the, if you will, background behind like the Open Meetings Act, right? That you can't have a group to have a group of people who make decisions informally without input from the masses, right? That's not democracy. That's not fair, right? So that, anyway, C. Wright Mills is famous for that sort of concept. And the military-industrial complex is an example of where you have military leaders, you have industry leaders, and you have government officials, and they make military war kinds of decisions that benefit them without any regard for, the people at the bottom who might actually have to go to war, right? That the reason it's called an industrial complex is because, places like Boeing, and I don't actually know all the names of the companies, but these companies who build airplanes and build bombs get rich, right, when the military and the government officials declare war. So you have these powerful influences making decisions, and it's those of us down here at the bottom that actually have to go to those wars and lose our life. So there's a quick synopsis of all the people. Some names you'll hear me talk about again, certainly Marx. Spencer's likely to show up on a quiz. And then the ideas that will show up on a quiz are social Darwinism, social fact, anomie, and these things. And I'm going to stop now. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the theories, which are these people's ideas.